What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Ultra Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Corcione, and super excited to bring on one of my favorite guests that I've had on the Everyday Ultra Podcast over the past year. Like, she is awesome, and I think she's probably one of your favorite guests too, if you've been a listener to the podcast, because we were talking before, she's just amassed a fandom in the ultra community over the past few years as well, and stoked to see her toe the line at Western States this year. Notably, she punched her golden ticket here after her impressive course record breaking race at the Black Canyon 100K, which she just impressed the many out there watching, including myself. And along the way too, she's been training and going hard and prepping for Western States, but she also has an exciting new accomplishment in passing the MCAT as well. So definitely want to chat about that. But she's really just garnished, like I said, a fandom and just a ton of support in the ultra running community for her authenticity, her amazing messages, and just everything she does to give back to the running community. She's a professional trail runner for Altra and GU, which are two amazing brands, and she is an amazing guest herself. So I'm excited to bring on Keely Henninger back to the Everyday Ultra Podcast. Keely, thanks so much for coming on again. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Like always, your introduction is way better than I could ever introduce myself, so thank you again.
You're welcome. Oh, well, of course, like I said, the introduction's always well deserved, so always happy to do so. And I want to dive into training for states and kind of how that's going. But before I do, talk to me about like this journey of the MCAT, right? Like that is a grueling process. Like by all means, it's an ultra marathon in its own right. And it was super cool to see you go from a huge goal like Black Canyon and then shift gears to a whole different kind of other goal. So I'd love to hear maybe how that kind of pivoting of different mindsets has maybe helped into your training as you pick back up coming into Western States training right after that. Like, tell me a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so immediately after Black Canyons, obviously before Black Canyons, I'd been studying a little bit, but after Black Canyons, it kind of marked this end of a running journey and start of a mental journey where I dedicated the next 2 months strictly to studying and cut my mileage roughly in half so that I wouldn't expend too much energy running, and I could spend a lot of time studying so that I wouldn't have to hopefully retake the MCAT. And it was a really welcomed shift. I had been kind of, training hardcore since my ankle injury allowed me to return to run so that I could be back in time for Black Canyon. And so having that 2 month break where I didn't prioritize running was really, really welcomed. And it was a really good mental shift for me to then, once I took the MCAT, be ready to just hit the ground running again and feel really, really stoked to start my training for Western States and feel really accomplished that I, spent all that time just studying for the MCAT. And it was really nice to separate the two instead of trying to, run a ton and also study a ton and just feel overcooked in everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that because it's like we only have like so much energy to kind of give out, like kind of what you were talking about in the original podcast, with which anyone who hasn't heard the first podcast we did with Keely, check it out. It is amazing, like one of the most profound conversations I've had. But you talk so much in that episode about like energy management and how we choose to deploy it, right? And sometimes if you're having too much in too many different areas, it can kind of lead to this lower performance in all areas, whether it's running or studying or anything like that, which is super, super cool. And, going through a big grueling process like the MCAT, it's just awesome to see you go out and accomplish that goal and then go into states. So kind of talking about your training, after the MCAT with states, I mean, I've been following along with your Strava and just have been just so impressed like throughout. So tell me a little bit about your training, how it's been going and how you're feeling kind of headed into the big day on Saturday.
Yeah, I think no different than most of my competition. I feel really good. That's obviously not anything that's new to people who are racing. Like, I'm sure everyone I'm racing feels great, but my training's been really well. I basically stopped the MCAT, had been maintaining like 50 or 60 miles a week so that I had a decent base, and then kind of just started right with some beastly hill workouts a la Tyler, and basically I've just been building from there. And luckily I got a lot of time down in Northern California and then a lot of time in Auburn and in Tahoe. So I've done a lot of miles on the course and have gotten to see the course on days as different as 95 degrees to 70 degrees, and in the evening and in the morning. And so I've just gotten a lot of miles and time on the course, and it's been really fun to run that much on the course because you actually experience all sorts of emotions. You have some runs where you feel really good and some runs where you just feel wrecked, and it's kind of nice to have all of those emotions before race day because you're certain to have all of them come race day as well. And so being able to run a lot on the course and kind of push through all of those different kinds of emotions has been really fun. And some of our mottos this year with training have just been to really nail the downhills, so that we have like a mantra for the downhills where we stay calm and we run them strong, but we're not running outside of our comfort zone. And we're like training on them a
Mm.
lot so that the quads are fine for all 100 miles. And then I think our second kind of training focus this year was really just focusing on climbing and focusing on really efficient climbing so that the canyons and all the big climbs in Western states don't feel that hard. And so I like to tell people that like the race feels like it's going to be easier than my training because there's just parts of training that are so hard. And so, having the race obviously going to be awfully hard as well, but coming off a really big training block that was awful, in a very good way, will make the race feel a lot more fun.
That's awesome. So do you like tend to prescribe maybe to there's like a motto out there. I've heard some people say it's like train hard, race easy kind of thing. Like, is that maybe how you look at like training relative to your races? Cause some people like to flip it the other way around, but do you more so prefer kind of like that former version there?
I think I would be careful saying train hard, race easy for all avenues of training, but I do think there should be a
Mm.
couple runs each week that really test you and that you can pull from come race day, whether that's a hill workout or a long run that has different parts of hard, like the course on it that are really difficult, that you can like pull from on race day and know that you've done something harder than the race. I do think that's really, really important. But then I think outside of those really challenging days, the days should be way easier than the race, right? So it should be like this balancing act of recovery days that are actually exceptionally easy, and then runs that are just exceptionally hard and are going to be way harder than anything you're going to have to push, hopefully, on race day.
That's awesome. I love that. Yeah, it's like running your easy days easy and your hard days hard. And it's like we want to take those two basically as easy as possible on the easy days. And then, we want to push ourselves on the hard days so we get like the maximal benefit of both without, being so hard on the easy days and being easy on the hard days and not getting that right training adaptation. Kind of speaking about the training, you mentioned like working on some downhills and making sure to preserve those things, which at Black Canyon, right, that's something you definitely have to do with the initial just drop that you get over the first 60K, so to say. I'm curious, like, what are some things that, you maybe look on in terms of like your Black Canyon performance and think, hey, like maybe on this race at Western States, I need to work on a little bit more because I didn't get to deploy it at Black Canyon and it pertains to this course. Like, how do you, I guess, measure that Black Canyon race with how you're approaching states from a more broader perspective?
Yeah, good question. I think going into Black Canyon, I was pretty solid in my aerobic capacity, so just my general fitness. And I realized that Black Canyon didn't have any crazy vert or crazy descending. And so I didn't need to like really pound the quads in training or pound the vert in training, but really just build a really good aerobic base. And I think I got to
Mm.
maintain that coming into stage training. And then I was able to really increase the vert in terms of the gain and the descent so that, when you do run that 15-mile descent from Robinson Flat into the first canyon, you don't get to that next descent and already feel your quads start to feel pretty tight and sore. So yeah, I'd say like we had a really good base coming out of Black Canyon so that we could just build a lot of more climbing and a lot more descending onto that base so that the muscle damage you get during a race like Western States isn't going to be as big of a factor because obviously, being able to run those last 20 miles is really, really crucial to doing well at Western States.
I love that. Yeah, it's a good comparison on the boat to say, hey, like I did well at Black Canyon, but hey, there's some areas that make Western states different, and like capitalizing on those things in your training, which is so cool. I'm curious from your perspective, does 100K or 100 miles excite you more? Like what do you like get more stoked about? Or is there like an equal level of stoke? Like, like, because I know some people like maybe it almost remisses me to say 100K is shorter, but it's still very long. But compared to 100 miles, it can be a little
Mhm.
shorter. But what stokes you more, like 100K or 100 miles?
That would depend on the race. I'd say
Hmm.
Western States gets me the most stoked out of all races, but I would not say all hundreds do. Most hundreds don't. So I don't know if I'm like a 100-mile connoisseur. I don't know if I have that drive, but I definitely love Western States and the kind of race that that is as a 100 mile, because I do think it fits to my strengths a lot more. And I just love the community and the trails. And so to me, that 100-mile is my favorite. But I also love like 50 miles and 100K because you can push the whole time. Like, especially something like Black Canyon, it runs kind of like a 50-mile. It's like under 9 hours. And so, to those listening who don't do ultras, that sounds really long. But to someone who does them relatively frequently, that kind of distance is a lot more reasonable that you can kind of push the whole time. Whereas Western States or like a 100-mile, you definitely have to address it like a little differently. And you have to start off a lot more conservatively than you would during a fast 100K or a 50-mile. And that also is really appealing to me. But again, not in the like general world of 100s. I'd say it's like very like right now very pointed towards Western States, and obviously that might change over time, but right now that's definitely my focus.
I love that approach. Yeah, because it's not just like, oh, I like 100 miles and it's broad based to like everything. It's more like, hey, like I know the things I enjoy. I know the things that are strong to my suits. Like I like how you're very conscious and not just like putting on, hey, like 100 miles is great. It more so depends on the situation where you're at. And I also love the versatility. Like you're to your point, you like 50 milers and different things to keep it shaken up in the mix. Kind of speaking on your prior experience, because I know you mentioned you love the community on States. I mean, this is a race that you're familiar with too. 2021 had an impressive finish out there, coming in at ninth female, earning that top 10 bid, which is great. Last year, of course, unfortunately, broke the hearts of myself and many to see what happened last year after having to pull out. But when you look at that race in 2021, when you had that impressive, finish out there, are there anything that you did well at that specific race that maybe you're taking into this one, going in? Now, granted, it's a different course this year with a little bit more exposure at the end, unfortunately, due to the burns and maybe a little bit more snow. But I'm curious, like, as you reflect on your 2021 finish, what are some things you're taking into there that maybe you're trying to channel during race day on Saturday?
Yeah, for 2021, I am really proud that I finished, and I finished staying very positive the whole time. And so looking back to 2021, it gives me the confidence that I need to know I can finish this race, which I think is really crucial for
Mm-hmm.
100 miles. My coach the other day said something along the lines of, you need to run a 100 in order to race a 100. And I couldn't agree more, because 2021 gave me the experience where I finished and I know what it takes to finish, and I know all of the things that I did wrong. And now I feel like, okay, I think I can actually start thinking of a 100 as a race instead of as something I need to finish. And that is exciting. And so I'll be pulling on all of the confidence I have from knowing that I can finish this race and finish it well. But then I'll also, take all of the learnings from 2021 and 2022 and be able to apply them to my race this year, which I think will just help immensely, because you learned so much your first year running Western States. I mean, I learned even stuff running, half of the race last year. And so bringing those findings and learnings into this race is really exciting, because I know that I can finish the race. Like, that's no longer an issue, because my first 100, like, I had no clue. I had ran 100Ks before. They didn't go super well. 100 miles is really far. And so knowing I can finish it, knowing I can finish it pretty well, even given a not well executed race, is really like exciting. And then taking all those learnings and putting them on top of that experience is really helpful.
So good. I love that quote too. It's you have to finish at 100 in order to race at 100, because that confidence to know that you can go the distance is, I can totally see how beneficial that is, because I think there, and I can relate to this. I remember when I was racing my first 100 miler, there is that uncertainty. It's like, I've never gone this far. Will I even finish? And it's like, if you have that kind of like mindset, it's hard to
Mhm.
really say, okay, I'm going to go all out here, might take a few risks here and there, and like really like strategize it when you're focused on finishing. So it's so cool to see that you took that experience,
Mhm.
after your 2021 experience too. And you mentioned in there, like kind of staying positive the whole time. And I know we talked a little bit about mindset, in our last podcast, which I thought was just awesome as you're talking about Black Canyon. But is there something maybe that you're looking to deploy mindset wise at Western States this Saturday that maybe is different than your Black Canyon race, or a few things, or is it more so staying on the same kind of strategy? Talk to me a bit about, how what's in your mental toolkit for Saturday coming up.
Yeah, I'd say there's two big trains of thought at play. The first one being very similar to a train of thought I had at Black Canyons, which is just running true to myself and not getting too caught up in the race until maybe it very much matters, which would be very late in the race, but just running very true to myself, not running someone else's race, not getting caught up in the race, like having to match someone's speed or whatever. And so that's going to be a very big focus, is just running something that feels really good to myself. And that doesn't matter, like if that means I'm in first, if it means I'm in 12th, that's fine. And then I'd say the second thing is just being very mentally flexible, because what I feel like in the past I would get fixated on is maybe something wouldn't go as planned, right? And all of a
Mm,
sudden this thing didn't go as planned, and so then the next thing doesn't go as planned because you're just like unable to cope with the inflexible nature of this sport. And knowing this race has a ton of snow in the beginning, and it also is a little bit more burned than normal, it's going to feel a lot more drier. And again, it's a stacked field, you can't control the other women. I would say, like, I'm just going to try to be very flexible. And so if I find myself running in snow, that's going to be part of it, and that's going to be a really fun experience, and I'm going to be very flexible to how that's making me run, instead of trying to fight the snow or fight the heat or fight whatever it is. And so just trying to be really, really true to myself and really, really flexible as the course kind of throws things your way. Those are kind of my two goals this year mentally.
yeah, I love that. Yeah, and we were talking a lot about that at Black Canyon. How when I was asking you, what do you think a big key to your success was, that I remember you mentioning like that exact thing. It's like, I ran true to myself on that day, and it stuck with me since. And it's so cool to see you taking that same thing at Western States. It being a very competitive race, and like you said, it's like, hey, like if it gets me, to fourth or ninth or whatever, like being true to myself is the goal, which is just super awesome to see that perspective out there too. It is also just awesome to see you like maybe, stack up against the field and everything, right? Like I said earlier on, like, and maybe for those listening who already listened to my preview episode, I definitely have you at the top of my picks out there. I think, you have what it takes to have an incredible day out there. Do you, even though you kind of have this mindset to run true to yourself, do you also still have the element of, competitiveness where you're kind of like assessing the field or a little bit? Or is it more so, hey, I'm just going to race my race and just kind of go out there? Like, how do you maybe, play the game more or less when it comes to maybe after Forest Hill or wherever it starts to really get into crunch time out there?
Yeah, so at Black Canyon, I found that as soon as I started getting caught up in the field, especially before that halfway point, I would do something really silly. I would twist an ankle, I would fall,
Mm,
and it didn't make any sense. It wasn't necessary. And
mhm,
so kind of my goal for Western States is to run the first, 100K very true to myself, being aware of where everyone is, but knowing and believing that whenever I doubted myself in Black Canyons or whenever I doubt myself in a workout, I reflect back on that race or I turn the next corner and they're the leaders. And so I need to remember that, like, when I'm running true to myself, I'm not going to be that far off where I want to be. And I need to stay true to that,
mm,
because as soon as I try to match someone else's speed or someone else's running style or whatever it is, that's not in my best interest. However, obviously I love competing, I love racing. When I get to Forest Hill, that mindset will start to change slightly. And I think, getting your first pacer will give you a little bit more confidence, a little bit more stoke. And again, we'll still keep you running true to yourself, but we'll keep the competition in mind a little bit more top of mind. And then I'd say getting to mile 80s, where it's like, this is where you are starting to push yourself past the limit you knew you had. And if I have to
Mm.
chase down people, if I'm holding people off, whatever it is, that's where like the race is for sure happening. And so, like, yeah, the first 100K, true to myself because I need to trust that that's good enough. And then the last, 60K or whatever it is, that's where you can slowly start ratcheting it in, that like the bungee almost, and winding up to be able to just crush that last 20 miles as fast as you possibly can.
So good. That analogy of a bungee is like a perfect example, right? Like you're building up all the energy, you're being conservative, and then you just kind of let it launch and go. And I love too when you were giving that answer, when you talk about the point to kick it up, it wasn't like let's go hunt down people. It was let's push, right? Let's focus on me, like what I can do. And it kind of relates to your point of, hey, I'm just focusing on me. And I know that if I get caught up in someone else's race, which, so often it can be easy to do out there, that's where mistakes start being made. And I think it's like a real big hallmark to your success too. Kind of also talking about the later stages of the race as well. Like I'm always curious to hear how people are taking on the heat out there, right? So you've been out there for 6 weeks, so to say. So very long time. I think the longest out of anyone who I've had on the podcast in this series so far. What's been like your go-to attack strategy on the heat out there, right? So you mentioned even before we started chatting that you were seeing some days that were 90 degrees, some days that were 60 degrees, like kind of the whole spectrum. So tell me a bit about kind of temperature management out there as you've been in Auburn for the past 6 weeks.
Yeah, so I've been living in Tahoe. So I've been living in Tahoe and driving down to the course a couple times a week. And
Oh, wow.
I think that's been nice because I've been getting a little bit of altitude and some heat up here, but then going to Auburn for the big days and getting really hot days there. And I would say the days where it's been like over 85 degrees on the course, I have almost the first two runs I did, I was always out of water. And so basically from those two runs where I guesstimated how much I needed, um, I started over correcting and bringing way too much water. And that was amazing. And finishing a run with like an extra bottle is the best feeling you can possibly have when it's really hot out. And so, come race day, you have way more aid stations, so that won't be as big of a problem. But I'd say the one thing that really has helped me run really well on the course and feel good is just overhydrating, like fueling whenever you're hungry, drinking whenever you're thirsty, and not having to ration any of that and just always having enough. And the runs where I've ended, where I've like either doubled my intake or have extra because I brought a lot, I felt amazing. And obviously, the runs where I ended on empty, where maybe I'd been rationing for the last hour and a half, 2 hours, those runs I don't feel so good. And so it was really a good reminder of how important it is to just stay on top of that stuff, because it's not fun to suffer. It's a lot more fun to feel good your whole run. And then I'd say the other part is not going to be any shocker to the listeners, but just getting wet as much as you can. So it's like you cross the little creeks, get in the creeks, dump your hat in the creek, put it on your body. Like I like to wear long sleeves and just get the whole shirt wet. And it's just like you get the littlest breeze and you feel that whole shirt kind of move, and it's very cooling. And so I think those kind of things are really, really important too. But yeah, can't highlight enough like how important it is to just have enough hydration, because it gets pretty dry out there. Like I was telling you, I've ran in the canyons like on a 95-degree day, a 90-ish degree day, 85-degree day, and then like a 70, 65-degree day. And aside from the 70 to 65-degree day, all those days feel really hot. So even if it is
Mm.
like a cooler year this year, it's still going to feel hot. And so you still need to take care of yourself. You still probably need to drink more than you think you need. And so just making sure to be on top of that is what I've found to be really, really helpful.
Yeah, that's such a good perspective that you mentioned that it's easy to look at the temperature of what it's going to be on Saturday and think, oh, it's going to be a cool year. But like, 80 degrees, even low or high 70s is still hot, especially on those sections where it's a lot more exposed than what people are probably normally used to having raced it in the past. So, to stay on top of the hydration and stay on top of that kind of, discipline throughout is really, really awesome. And I know like on Black Canyon, we chatted a lot about like your fueling strategy and how and you're a big also advocate too, just outside of your own running about, fueling and taking care of yourself. Any kind of maybe changes that you're making after Black Canyon for this race specifically, or is it pretty much kind of staying the similar strategy of what you've been going in terms of maybe what you're eating, how often you're eating, how often you're hydrating, and or because it's maybe a little hotter, you got a lot more vert in this kind of race. Are there adaptations you're making to your fueling strategy that you think are necessary, or is it pretty much similar?
Yeah, I'd say for fueling, I won't change much. For Black Canyon, I did a lot of gels, a lot of liquid gels, and a lot of Roctane. And for me, that just sits really well, even in hot temperatures. And so I'll still shoot for like my 60 grams of carbohydrate baseline per hour. That's not going to change at all. And then, it's just a longer race. So it's just sustained for longer. But I will probably drink more than I drank at Black Canyon, even though I felt like I drank a lot at Black
Mm,
Canyon too. And so I don't really have like a hydration plan because I think that you just can tell when you're thirsty. And so sometimes I like to think like, oh, I need one bottle an hour, but maybe that turns into two, and maybe 1 hour it's three because you're just so thirsty. And that's totally fine. And so
mm,
for me, because I know that hydration is so important, and also when it's a hot race, you just are inherently thirsty. I don't put too much weight into that. One thing I probably will add to this race that I didn't do at Black Canyon is just doing like maintenance salt tabs
mm.
throughout the race, like probably every hour, just because it is hot and it's so long, your propensity to cramp or like have any of that stuff flare up is also pretty high. So just staying on top of the hydration as much as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the extra salt and just being on top of that hydration. Because to your point, it can be easy to maybe take one bottle less, or like for the sake of weight, or maybe not drink as much. But to have that hydration on
Mm.
point. Because even when we were talking about in our first conversation, like you mentioned like the hydration is usually the thing that goes first, and when that goes, like so many other things can go out the window, right? And so to see you being so
Mhm.
diligent and even just going even deeper on that at Western States, I think is an awesome kind of thing too. One thing also, just to kind of touch on a few more points here, I remember earlier in the conversation you mentioned coming up with certain mantras at different parts. So I definitely want to touch on like the mindset kind of thing. What are some mantras that maybe you're looking to, tell yourself during the race? Like if you're willing to share them, I know some people like to keep the mantras close to heart, which I totally respect, but curious to hear if you have like any mantras you're pulling out on race day that maybe you've been practicing throughout the last 6 weeks as you're on the course.
Yeah, I would say that the first 50K, my mantra is really just like flexibility. And so it's just like, don't think about the
Mm,
time, don't think about where place you're in, just like get through the section, don't force anything, just run true to yourself and be very flexible because it might throw like a ton of crazy snow at you. You might like drop through a snowbank, like who knows, right? Like it's going to be a little bit of a different race. And so just being very flexible with that 50K is I think going to be really important. And then yeah, for the canyons, like I love the canyons. They are probably like my favorite part of the course. And so I always make mantras for those climbs because the first one is really steep. And so that one for me is like a time to just feel very strong. And then the second one is like steep at the bottom, but kind of like not so steep at the top. So that one I think is more like you need to be really steady, and then you need to be steady and smart so that you're not like gassing it up the first part and then having to walk the top of the second canyon. You're being really smart about what you're doing. So maybe you're hiking the bottom and running the top. Like you're just being steady and smart. And then the last one is kind of like, the final one. And so that one's where we start to really like embrace feeling good and feeling really strong again, going back to Forest Hill. So it's like the first one's going to be strong, strong and steady. The second one's going to be a little more patient and steady and strong. And then the last one, again, because it's smaller, like it's a time to like embrace that you're like done and your like strength is there and that you can like push through the last one. But yeah, I also am weird and I like the canyon. So don't know.
that I think that's such an edge. Like when you said that, like I was getting chills because a lot of people say, "Oh, they almost dread the canes, or it can be easy to because that's where it starts to get super hot. That's where it starts to really like start to eat at your legs, like on the climbs and stuff." But the fact that you're stoked and you really like the canyons, I think that's such an awesome edge to have, at a place where it can be intimidating for some people out there, which is just super cool to see that. Kind of in the same vein of mindset, I really love the post that you recently put on Instagram talking about tapering because I think almost anyone can kind of relate to like being in that taper and just starting to think about, oh man, am I doing enough? Or like you start to get a little niggle here or there and you're like, oh man, like what's going on? So like more so maybe if it's not like this specific taper, like talk to me about how you manage, like some people call it the taper tantrums, the taper scaries, like there's so many different words for it, right? Or just tapering, like even can bring up those thoughts in myself for sure. How do you make sure to trust yourself fully in those moments of tapering when these little things can pop up and almost kind of like question, yourself. Cause I think a lot of people listening can relate. I know I can for sure. And I think you do an excellent job, not just with the taper, but just in believing in yourself in your training and racing, that I just love to hear your perspective on this. So I'm curious to hear like how you instill
Yeah.
that belief through the taper process.
Yeah, I think I'm like everyone else in the fact that tapering is not easy. But I do think that when you're in the sport long enough or you've experienced the taper tantrums enough, you kind of embrace them. I actually was talking to Katie Asmuth about this, and she was like, I actually love when I feel the taper tantrums because I know that it's coming and I know what it means. I know that I'm getting close to a race. And I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but I do think that for me, I always have to remind myself that it always happens. There's going to be times where you don't feel good, and there's going to be times where you feel phenomenal, and those times that you don't feel good will trump those times you feel phenomenal because you'll question everything. You'll say, why
Mm,
do I feel tired today? I haven't been running much. I've just had a down week. I should feel phenomenal. And the truth is, that's not always the case. Like, yes, sometimes you will feel good and sometimes you'll feel bad, and that's okay. What I like to do is reflect on my entire training journey and go through all of the things that I did that were positive or new for me or really impressive to me. And I feel funny saying impressive to me because it feels very like confident, but I think that everyone can find stuff in their newest or latest training block that was something really hard for them and they're really impressed that they got through it. And so when I start feeling really crummy on my taper, I try to reflect on all of my training and be like, no, it is all there. Like 100% it is there. And I think for me, this taper round, I got really lucky because Black Canyons is still really fresh. And the week before
mm.
Black Canyons, I was texting my coach, like, I don't know if I should race. Like, because I felt awful on one run and it messed with my head. And then, he's like, no, no, you're fine. And then the next day I felt fine. And so I have that recent memory to remind myself that the taper is not always linear. It's very much like up and down, and it is all going to be okay.
Yeah, and I love that how you're like when you talk about the things that impress you, right? Because we all have those moments, and sometimes it can be easy to forget those in the times when we don't feel as good, or our brain has that negativity bias, right? Like it's that classic thing where it's like you get 99
Oh, yeah.
compliments and one piece of critical feedback, you're always honing in on that critical feedback. The same is true with our runs, right? Like usually we focus on the bad ones,
Yeah.
so it's cool to see that you reflect on those when you reflect too, because the one thing I've always appreciated about you is you're very reflective and introspective of your journey and things like that. Do you write these things down? Or are they like more like a practice that you just kind of sit and reflect on? Like I'm curious because I personally don't write things down, and I'm wondering like if other people do, like, and I don't know if it like makes it much more stronger. So I guess tell me about like what that maybe reflection in process in general kind of looks like for you when you're kind of trying to remind yourself of how awesome you are, or reflecting on a race recap. How do you approach those reflections?
Yeah, so I would say my most recent reflection for this race, I did not write down, but I spent, a good
Mm,
hour or half an hour just kind of going through a lot of things and just putting them in my mind. And I think my mind holds on to runs and running statistics pretty easily, so it wasn't necessary for me to write them down. However, for example, when I was reflecting on the MCAT study process, because I was kind of a nutcase in my taper for that too, because yes, I did taper for that test. I did not crazy study right up to it. I was really, really like scared that I didn't do enough. And my therapist actually gave me this idea because I normally don't write things down either, but I wrote down every single thing I did, all of the pages read, all of the tutorials watched, all of the hours of classes I took, all of the practice problems, all of these things. I wrote them all down, and seeing that sheet was really cool and really powerful. And I had to believe that that was as much as I was willing to put into it, and it was enough. And so I think I'll probably translate that into future runs. I don't know if I'll need it for this taper crazy. The taper's not over yet, so maybe I will. But I do think there's some advantage to writing some stuff down because it feels a lot more powerful that way. So yeah, I could see trying it for running too.
yeah, and I love how you brought that experience from, taking the MCAT too. So first of all, awesome to hear that you taper for that too. Like I've never thought of that, because man, I've had so many times where I've had to cram for a test, and just like cramming your training for an ultra usually probably doesn't go as well. So that's an awesome strategy, but it's so cool to see that, you were going through and writing down all the things you did to prepare for the MCAT and looking at it. And I got chills when you said you looked at the sheet of paper and just saw it like visibly of all the things on there. So that's super cool to see, and definitely curious to see if, that's something you put, post Western States, and kind of in your training going forward and stuff. And so for Western States too, for this whole like preview series, usually at the end of the show, if someone's hasn't been on the podcast, I ask the standard question, what can our listeners do every day? But since you've been on the show, and this is a podcast about Western States, I am changing up the question a little bit. And the question to you, Keely, is, you mentioned earlier how Western States is such a special race for you. And so when you think about, your time on the course, and, racing this race before, is there a memory that keeps coming back to you, specific to Western States, one that has been maybe really impactful on your life, or one that you really cherish like deeply and makes you want to come back to the race? Is there a memory that particularly comes to mind for you?
Yeah, there are two. One is extremely positive, and that is from my first year where I got to No Hands Bridge and saw the lights at Roby Point, and I knew that I could finish 100 miles. And it was such a powerful feeling to know that, like, after that whole journey, like, you were gonna do it. And that feeling I don't think will ever go away. And I hope to feel that feeling this year as well. Like, I still think even if you've run 2500s, finishing 100 miles is so freaking cool. And it's so far. And being able to do that is so impressive. And so feeling that feeling at the end is really cool to like know you actually did it. And then I'd say the second one is like a little more somber, but I think resonates in a very positive way. And I'd say like the feeling I had
Mm.
last year at Michigan Bluff was extremely visceral and like probably like one of the biggest heartbreaks I've had in my career, just because I think I was finally so willing to go all into the sport and really just push myself to a limit that I hadn't done before. And so to have that all like kind of crash down on this very unexpected, very quick event was so heart wrenching. And so but like I can reflect on that feeling, and that feeling gives me so much stoke and so much passion for going back out there and like doing to the best of my ability to not have that happen again. But also acknowledging that like it's also really cool to feel that strongly about something because it shows that you really care. And so it just fills me with like a lot of joy for this year, knowing that like I do care a lot about this race, but I also like am really stoked to be back and like hopefully, do something that's a little better than what happened last year.
Yeah, 100%. Have you thought about like coming across that same moment like this year in training? Like, have you thought like, oh, like what that feeling might be like, kind of coming across that spot? Because I hear all the time, like when people go at a race and maybe something happens to them, like they always mention how they think about that spot in certain ways. Some people want revenge on it, some people like want to celebrate it, some people,
Mhm.
want to just not even look. Like, have you thought about that kind of going into the race?
Yeah. Yeah, I've ran the section where the second time I twisted my ankle at the bottom of El Dorado Canyon, I've ran that section almost 8 times. And the
Oh,
first
wow.
2 times my coach made me stop and actually like pay homage to it and be like, you know what, this is different. And something that was really moving to me was that the whole area was actually burned. And so it's actually like
Oh,
100% different than it was last year. And to me, that was really,
wow.
really powerful. And then, the first time I twisted it before it got really bad was at mile 9. And, what's also really cool about this year is that mile 9 is going to be full of snow. And so, like, to me, it feels really cool to know that last year was 100% different than what I'm going to experience this year. And so, like, I have nothing, like, I don't have any memories on this course. This course is completely new.
Yeah, wow, that's so cool. First of all, I love that you paid homage to the spot, right? Because like I said before, some people want to get like revenge on the spot, but paying homage, like that's powerful to see. And then it is an interesting experience to think like, oh, there's burn over here, and then there's snow, so it kind of like switches up the dynamic on it. So it's awesome to hear your perspective on it, and so cool to see that you've paid homage to it, got to experience it in a new light. And I know on Saturday, when you get to that point too, it's going to probably be another special moment too, as you're roaring all the way to Auburn for the finish for sure. And Keely, I'm super excited to follow your journey. Anyone listening here, please follow Keely. Like every time I have a conversation with her, which is only twice now, but still, it feels like so many times because I learn so much every time I chat with you. Please follow along her journey. I'll put links to her social in the bio, and her podcast too, which is incredible. Definitely listen into that. But Keely, my friend, thank you so much for coming on the show, and best wishes to you this Saturday. I know you're going to absolutely crush it, and I know you're going to have a great race. So appreciate you tons.
Thanks so much, Joe.
You got it. All right, let's see.